So picture a man who wakes up one morning and decides with total confidence that what the Caribbean really needs is a massive shipment of wool mittens. The Caribbean, where it is hot enough to fry an egg on a rock, and where not one single person has ever, in the entire history of the islands, looked out at the blazing sun and thought, you know what would really hit the spot right now? A nice warm mitten. And then picture that same man shipping coal to a city that is already practically built out of coal, sending bed, warmers to the tropics, buying up shiploads of stray cats, and at one point faking his own death just to find out who would actually bother to cry at his funeral. Now here's the part that breaks your brain a little. Every single one of those ridiculous doomed, what on earth is he thinking decisions somehow ended up making him richer? This is the story of Timothy Dexter, a barely literate leather worker who stumbled and bluffed and got lucky his way into becoming one of the wealthiest men in early America. A man who crowned himself a lord, wrote one of the worst books ever put to paper, and somehow died laughing all the way to the bank. And by the end of this year, going to be asking yourself the same question everyone who's ever heard his name asks, which is, how on earth does the dumbest sounding businessman in history keep winning? Timothy Dexter was born in January of 1747 in Malden, Massachusetts, into a poor farming family that didn't have much of anything to give him, least of all an education, which is a detail that becomes extremely important later when we get to his writing. He was put to work in the fields as a young boy, and by his teens he'd apprenticed himself to a leather worker, learning the slow, unglamorous, hence stained brown trade of tanning hides and turning them into the boots and breeches that ordinary people actually bought. And when that apprenticeship finally ended, he walked into the busy port town of Newburyport with a couple of coins rattling in his pocket and absolutely no plan whatsoever. What he did have, though, was nerve and a kind of bottomless, unshakable belief in himself. And as the universe was about to demonstrate over and over again, the single most valuable business asset any human being has ever possessed, which is an almost supernatural, gravity-defying streak of pure dumb luck. His first clever move had nothing to do with leather at all, because in 1769, when he was 22 years old, he married a widow named Elizabeth Frothingham, who happened to come with a house, a respectable position in the community, and most importantly, some money, which meant that a man who had arrived in town with nothing now suddenly had a roof over his head, a base to work from, and a little bit of capital to start playing with. The marriage itself, by all accounts, was not a happy one. The two of them would spend the next several decades bickering and feuding, and Dexter would eventually take a revenge on her so strange that we'll have to come back to it later. But for the moment it gave him exactly the launch pad he needed to make the bet that every sensible, educated, respectable person in Massachusetts told him flat out was the move of a complete idiot. To understand that bet, you have to remember where the country was in the years right after the revolution, which is to say flat broke. Because to pay for the war, the government had printed enormous quantities of paper money, the continental dollar, and by the 1780s that money had become so completely worthless that people coined an actual phrase about it, not worth a continental. And the smart wealthy Well, connected merchants were dumping the stuff as fast as they possibly could, taking pennies on the dollar just to get it out of their hands before it became even more useless. Timothy Dexter looked at all of that and did the exact opposite of everyone he was supposed to be learning from, because he took whatever money he could pull together and he bought the worthless currency up by the wheelbarrow. Load, hoarding the very thing that the entire town agreed was good for nothing but wallpaper. And the respectable merchants of Newburyport laughed themselves silly, and some of them, the story goes, actively encouraged him to keep doing it, because they could not wait to watch the uneducated nobody finally ruin himself and learn his proper place. And then the brand United States government, under its brand new constitution, with Alexander Hamilton running the treasury, decided to honor its old debts and make that currency good again. At a fraction of its original value, sure, but Dexter had bought it for so close to nothing that it didn't matter. And he walked away from the whole thing with a genuine fortune, while the men who'd laughed at him were left standing there blinking. And whether that was sly cunning or blind luck is something people have argued about for 200 years, but either way it set the pattern for absolutely everything that came after, which is that Timothy Dexter does the laughably wrong thing and the universe inexplicably hands him a reward for it. Now that he was rich, Dexter started buying ships and dabbling in overseas trade. And the merchants who already couldn't stand him because he was loud and uneducated and knew money and insisted on shoving himself in among people who considered themselves his betters, saw their opening to finally, properly destroy him, and the weapon they chose was bad advice delivered with a straight face. When he came around asking how a man makes real money in shipping, they told him, with all the sincerity they could fake, that what he ought to do was send a load of coal to Newcastle, which at the time was a famous expression for doing something completely pointless. Because Newcastle in England was the coal capital of the entire world, and shipping coal, there was the 18th century equivalent of trucking sand into the Sahara, and they fully expected him to load up a vessel, sail it across the Atlantic, sell nothing, and lose his shirt. So of course Dexter did exactly what they suggested and shipped his coal to Newcastle. And his ships happened to arrive right in the middle of a coal miners' strike. So the one city on earth that should never have needed a single lump of imported coal was suddenly desperate for it. And there was Timothy Dexter sitting on a full shipment with a smile on his face, selling it all at a profit, while the men who'd set the trap watched their prank blow up in the most spectacular way imaginable. And if you're tempted to write that off as a one-time fluke, you simply have to look at what happened next, because his rivals, still convinced they could bankrupt him, suggested he ship bed warming pans to the West Indies. And a warming pan, for anyone who's never seen one, is a long-handled metal basin that you fill with hot coals and slide under your blankets on a freezing night, which is a wonderful thing to own in a New England and winter, and an utterly insane thing to send to the tropical Caribbean, where it never gets cold at all. So naturally Dexter shipped tens of thousands of them, except the islands were covered in sugar and molasses plantations. And somebody took one look at that long handle and that wide metal pan and realized it made an absolutely perfect ladle for skimming boiling molasses, and the thing sold out. Then he sent warm woolen mittens to those same sweltering islands, which should finally have been the loss that broke him, except Asian merchant ships happened to be passing through, bought the entire stock, and carried the mittens off to sell in the bitter cold of Siberia and the Far East. So once again he turned the guaranteed disaster into money. And at a certain point, you genuinely start to wonder whether this man had quietly signed some kind of contract at a crossroads at midnight. The absurd victories just kept coming, each one a little more ridiculous than the last, because he bought up something like 20,000 Bibles on a hunch that a wave of religious fervor was coming. And when it came, he sold every last one of them by telling buyers that no family could possibly get into heaven without one. And he shipped boatloads of stray cats to the Caribbean for no reason anyone could fathom, except the islands were overrun with rats chewing through the warehouses and the plantations, so the cats became prized, valuable mousers, and he made money on cats, of all things. And somewhere in there, he cornered a market in whalebone for ladies' corsets too. Every single rule of sensible commerce says this man should have been wiped out a dozen times over, because he bought what nobody wanted and shipped it where nobody needed it, and acted on advice that was specifically engineered to ruin him. And yet he just kept winning and winning until, by the 1790s, Timothy Dexter was extraordinarily, almost obscenely rich, and a newly rich man with something to prove always needs a way to show it off. So he bought himself a grand mansion in Newburyport and set about turning it into an enormous monument to the one subject in the whole world that truly fascinated him, which was Timothy Dexter. And he started by simply giving himself a title, declaring himself Lord Timothy Dexter, the first lord in the United States, in a country that had quite literally just fought a long and bloody war specifically to get rid of lords. And then he commissioned around 40 huge wooden statues to line the grounds of his estate, towering carved figures of the great men of history, George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Napoleon and kings and generals and philosophers, all of them standing guard around his house. And then, right in the middle of all those world-shaking giants, he placed a statue of himself with an inscription that announced to anyone who walked by that here stood the greatest philosopher in the entire Western world, which was a fairly bold claim for a former leather tanner who, as we're about to see, could not reliably spell his way through a single sentence. Because in 1802, having decided that a man of his obvious importance simply had to leave a book behind for posterity, Timothy Dexter sat down and wrote one, and he called it A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, and it is, with real affection, one of the worst books anyone has ever published, and also one of the most accidentally delightful. A long rambling outpouring of his opinions on his neighbors and politicians and his wife, and, above all, his own greatness, written across thousands of words with essentially no punctuation anywhere in the entire thing, and with spelling so gloriously, defiantly wrong that reading it feels like being shouted at by a man with a thick accent and a mouth full of food, and people bought it. It became a curiosity and then a genuine little sensation, and they printed more editions of it. And when readers complained that the book was completely impossible to follow because it didn't contain a single comma or period anywhere. Dexter responded in the second edition with what I honestly think might be the most brilliantly stupid solution in the history of literature, which was to add one extra page at the very end covered in nothing but rows and rows of punctuation marks, commas, periods, question marks, exclamation points, all just sitting there in a block, along with a note telling his readers, in his own glorious spelling, to pepper and salt it as they please, meaning go ahead and season the book yourselves. Sprinkle the punctuation wherever you'd like it, because he certainly wasn't going to do it for you. Which finally brings us to the single strangest thing this remarkably strange man ever did, and given everything you've just heard, you understand that the bar for that was almost impossibly high. Because Dexter became consumed by the question of how the world would react to his death, how deeply he'd be mourned, and how many tears would be shed over the great Lord Dexter. And rather than wait around to die like a normal person and miss the whole show, he decided to simply stage his own funeral while he was still very much alive. So he had a coffin prepared and spread the word that he had passed, and by some accounts around 3,000 people turned out to mourn him while he hid nearby, watching the crowd, waiting to be moved by the sheer depth of public grief. And then he slipped off to a back room where his wife Elizabeth, the woman he'd been feuding with for the better part of 30 years, was apparently not crying nearly hard enough over her supposedly dead husband, and so Lord Timothy Dexter, the deceased, rose up from the dead and caned his own wife for failing to grieve with sufficient enthusiasm at his fake funeral, which is, I think you'll agree, the single most Timothy Dexter sentence that could ever possibly be assembled. And while that particular story has certainly grown a little taller in 2 centuries of retelling, it's an inseparable part of the legend, and it tells you everything you could ever need to know about the size of the man's ego. He died for real in October of 1806 at the age of 59 and was buried in Newburyport, though, in one last little irony, not in the grand tomb he'd built for himself on his own grounds. And the question he leaves behind is the same one he raised the very first time he bought up that worthless money, which is whether he was a complete fool who got impossibly lucky over and over again, or whether he understood something that all those educated, respectable merchants who laughed at him never did. Because on one level, he really is the patron saint of failing upward, living proof that you can do absolutely everything wrong and still come out on top if the dice happen to love you, and his rivals fed him terrible advice, hoping to watch him drown. And he turned every single prank into profit. But there's a more generous way to see it too, which is that maybe Dexter grasped something genuinely true about the world, that markets are wild and unpredictable, that demand can appear out of nowhere in the most unlikely places, and that the obvious, smart move is very often just everyone making the exact same mistake together while congratulating each other on how clever they are, and that buying up what nobody wants precisely because nobody wants it, and it's therefore dirt cheap, isn't stupidity at all, but in a certain light is one of the oldest and shrewdest tricks in the entire history of money. Either way, the man got the last laugh on his rivals and on the critics of his book and on every single person who ever counted him out, because a poor, barely literate leatherworker willed himself into a lord and a philosopher and an author and a legend that people are still telling stories about more than 200 years later, which is honestly not bad at all for a man whose entire business strategy seems to have been to do the single dumbest possible thing in every situation and simply trust that somehow, some way, it would all work out. And somehow, every single time, it did.